Welcome to the first lecture in BIO 104, where we will go over an introduction to evolutionary theory. One of the early theories describing the diversity of life was that the Earth was relatively new in formation and that species remain unchanged, meaning that they were born or designed in the form in which they exist. Hutton developed the concept of gradualism. Though it was originally used to explain changes in the Earth's structure, it was also used to explain how species can change in their form over time. Thomas Malthus developed the concept of population overproduction and how an overpopulation of individuals within a certain area could lead to competition effects. These two scientists were very important in developing the foundation for evolutionary theory. Jean-Baptiste Lamarck was also an important scientist that laid the foundation for evolutionary theory. His theory of evolution, however, was based on the idea that organisms can adapt and change. However, they are moving towards an increase in complexity with respect to their body design. He stated organisms can adapt quickly and can pass on these traits. However, his theory was based on use and disuse, meaning that if an organism uses a structure, it will be kept within their body form, and if they no longer use a structure, it will then be lost. This was used to explain giraffes' necks growing over generations due to stretching and the limbless nature of snakes. However, we now know that the mechanisms that cause these changes are much more complicated than simple use and disuse. An important event in the development of evolutionary theory was the voyage of the Beagle between 1831 and 1836. On this voyage, Darwin observed many geological processes that occurred in many geographic areas. He also observed fossils and cataloged many different animals and plants, and looked at their distribution over this geographic area. He made two major findings. One, he noticed that there were adaptations or similarities between closely related species, and he also noticed that there were similarities between the fossil record and current species that were alive in the areas that he studied. One of the important groups of organisms that Darwin studied during his voyage were the Galapagos finches. Darwin also developed many important terms that we still use today. Adaptations were defined as inherited characteristics, meaning characteristics that could be passed on from parent to offspring. And these adaptations are characteristics that can increase the survival and reproductive success in a particular environment. He also noted that some species were endemic, meaning that they were completely unique to a specific area or to a specific island. With respect to his Galapagos finches, he noted that many of these finches were very similar with respect to size and with respect to their morphology. However, they had different beaks, and these different sizes and different shaped beaks actually reflected differences in their diet. This means that by having different beak shape, they were able to utilize different resources or feed on different resource types, and this would allow for decreased competition between individuals and also would lead to speciation, meaning that many of these species would be able to coexist despite being limited to a small specific area. And this is because the changes in beak size allowed for changes in diet that would allow for decreased competition and coexistence for all of these species in the same space. By studying the differences and similarities between all of these closely related species, Darwin proposed that there was an original species that originated from the mainland that spread to the Galapagos Islands, which then underwent a speciation event. At the same time that Darwin was developing his theory of evolution, another scientist, Alfred Wallace, was developing a very similar theory as well. Initially, Darwin was hesitant to publish his results due to the potential controversy that it would cause. Alfred Wallace submitted a manuscript for Darwin to actually review about his own ideas of evolution, and noted that there were marked similarities with Darwin's own thoughts. Darwin then published his book shortly after he reviewed this manuscript with an extensive scientific support for his theory. It is still debated to this day who should have gotten attributed to the actual theory of evolution, whether it be Darwin or whether it be Wallace. Regardless of who deserves credit, Darwin presented an extensively supported theory. In his work, The Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, he based the theory of evolution on three main observations: the unity or similarities that he noted of life forms, the diversity he noted in life forms, and also by stating that organisms are suited to their environment. This led to the Darwinian view of the descent with modification. This means that organisms originally descend from a common ancestor, and as these ancestors pass through generations or descent occurs, species can accumulate differences that can change and adapt over time. This he referred to as modification. He also envisioned this history as a branching pattern, which looks very much like our current phylogenetic trees. He noticed that there were gaps between groups that could be explained by branches and potential past extinction events. So he combined the observations that he made in the fossil record along with his observations that he made from current living species. Darwin proposed his theory of evolution formally by natural selection in 1859. The main tenets of this theory are as follows. In order for natural selection to occur, individuals in a population must vary. This means that you must have genetic variation within a population. You cannot have a population of clones. This gives nothing for natural selection to work against. Another important tenet to this theory is that there must be the overproduction of offspring. This overproduction of offspring would then lead to competition. This competition will lead to unequal reproductive success, where some individuals will not be able to reproduce while others will be more likely to reproduce. Those that are considered to be the most fit are the most likely to survive and have their offspring. Over time, the adaptive traits that are passed on from one generation to the next would eventually lead to the overall genetic evolution of the entire population. It's important to note that natural selection acts on the individual level, but the effects can be seen in the overall population. Another important thing to consider and remember is that these traits must be heritable, meaning that these traits that are considered adaptive must be able to be passed on from parent to offspring in order for natural selection to act. Natural selection is used in many different forms present day. Select desirable traits. We use it for selecting for traits in the agriculture industry, for instance, picking more resistant animals to be able to increase milk yields or increase muscle mass, and as well for domestic breeding. As stated previously, you have many individuals that are under these selective pressures. The overall effects can be seen in the population as a whole. The original theory of evolution was based on competition, as this was the most important and most recognized interaction between individuals or between species at the time. However, the field of ecology has developed much more over the years, and we now recognize that competition is not the only mechanism that natural selection can work through. Natural selection can work through other factors and other mechanisms such as predation, mutualism, and facilitation. There are many lines of evidence for evolution. Patterns of evolution are typically supported by using various lines of data. These data can be obtained through direct observations, by studying homology or the similarity between structures, by examining the fossil record, and by understanding the biogeography of species, meaning looking at how species are distributed over a landscape. One of the most classic examples of natural selection involves the peppered moth during the Industrial Revolution. As industries and manufacturing increased during the Industrial Revolution, there was a large amount of pollution that was released into the air. This pollution and ash deposited on the trees and causing the trees to darken. Within the peppered moth populations, there were light and dark variants. When the Industrial Revolution occurred and the trees began to darken, the predation levels increased on the lighter variants. This means that the lighter variant moths were removed from the population and thus were not passing on their genes to the next generation. This led the darker moths to have an increase in fitness, meaning that they had an increased survival, so they were more likely to survive and pass on their genes for the darker variant wings to their offspring. This overall led the population to have a darker coloration. Another example of natural selection is what occurs with antibiotic resistance. Bacteria have an incredibly fast generation time, which means they are also highly adaptable. Drugs have been designed to kill resistant strains. This means that they are targeted to kill off more susceptible individuals. However, in doing so, this unintentionally favors the persistence of more resistant individuals. Staphylococcus aureus, for example, is relatively harmless. However, some strains can be very harmful, such as penicillin-resistant strains, MRSA, and USA 300. Another example of natural selection can be examined when you look at homologous structures. These are structures that have high similarities because they share a common ancestor. If we take a look at the structure of the arm in the human, cat, whale, and bat, we can notice that the overall bone pattern, meaning the humerus, radius, ulna, carpals, metacarpals, and phalanges, are all present in all four organisms, indicating that they do indeed share a common ancestor. However, you can also notice that there is a very great difference in the morphology of these features that reflects the individual organism's adaptations to its own environment. Another example of shared homology can be seen by studying embryogenesis. Early stages of development can show many ancestral similarities even if they are not seen in the adult stages. This particularly pertains to the presence and absence of vestigial structures, the tail, and the gill arches. Many of these structures can be seen in the human embryo, for instance. However, these become lost when the adult takes its final form. Evolutionary trees can provide a valuable insight into shared ancestry between groups of organisms and also into divergence events. Take a look at the diagram below to see some of the shared characteristics that are present within various tetrapods. You can see that digit-bearing limbs originated early in the lineage, and this is common in amphibians down to hawks and other birds. However, you can also see that the development of feathers is a relatively late characteristic that has been derived, and that could be present in ostriches. Another example of natural selection occurs during convergent evolution. This is the independent evolution of shared characteristics between two completely unrelated organisms. Take, for instance, the North American. We can also gain insight into the theory of evolution by examining the fossil record. If we take a look at the layers of fossa in the sedimentary rock, we can get an idea of the organisms that lived in the past. The fossil record is very important in confirming mass extinction events and also in showing some origin events of when species arise. The fossil record yields a vast amount of information with respect to the diversity and origin of species. The fossil record holds a vast amount of information regarding the origin of cetaceans. Cetaceans are sea mammals such as whales, dolphins, and porpoises. Previously, it was unknown where the origin of these species actually occurred. Did they originate as aquatic species, or did they originate from a terrestrial environment? By studying the fossil record and by examining both limb structure and pelvic structure, as seen to the diagram on the right, between organisms in the fossil record as well as living cetaceans, as well as looking at DNA similarities between organisms in the fossil record as well as current organisms, and looking at the DNA similarities between those particular organisms and more terrestrial organisms such as hippopotamus and ungulates, it was determined that they must have shared a terrestrial ancestor that then moved back into the marine environment, and that the overall structure of these cetaceans then reflects adaptations to their environment to represent more similar fish species. The study of biogeography also yields important information for the theory of evolution. Biogeography involves the scientific study of a species' geographical distribution. This can be used to look at past distribution of species or fossils as well as the current distribution of animals. It is originally believed that the Earth originally consisted of one large continent called the Pangaea. This was then separated due to tectonic plate shifts and continental drift. Understanding these patterns of continental drift and understanding species distribution patterns, both in the fossil record and current distribution, allows us to predict where these species actually originated from. Within the study of biogeography, islands are very important. Islands provide us with a very unique glimpse into the processes of evolution. In general, islands typically have high levels of diversity despite their small size and limited resources. Many islands, such as Madagascar, Australia, and the Galapagos Islands, have endemic species, which are species that are unique to those specific areas and that cannot be found in any other location in the world. This high level of diversity is typically the result of a common ancestor that originated from a mainland. Once the island became isolated, then speciation events occurred, which led to the radiation or the creation of multiple species from that one common ancestor. If the one common ancestral species populated multiple islands and then these islands drifted away and then become isolated, this would then lead to multiple speciation events, as seen in the Galapagos Islands. Islands are very important in studying both island biogeography and evolutionary theory.